for those good words. Now, first of all, let me congratulate all PGs who have opted for a premium college in Kerala. And when you start your course, you'll find out that you have very good clinical material, the interpersonal relation is very good, and then you get things done very easily in this college. So first of all, let me congratulate all of you for having opted this college. Now, you have over these days, you have come across the various nuances of identifying a topic, then deciding the study design, calculating the sample size, this, that, all knickknacks you have understood. Now, the final stage is how to apply for a request or how to apply for permission seeking studies. So, that is what I am about to talk to you all. Okay. So, my topic is ethics in biomedical research. And as has been pointed out by the vice principal, I am the member secretary. You later know about my specific role in the ethics committee in this institute. Okay, so by word of introduction, I'll just tell you what research is. You have already understood what research is. It is a careful, systematic, diligent search, and biomedical research means a careful, systematic, and diligent research done on human subjects. And in various contexts, you find the word participant, subject, etc., and then there is some argument as to whether you should call them participants or subjects. That is up to you. Okay. And then there are different types of, especially two types of studies. One is the sponsored trial, and the other is the investigator initiated. In a sponsored trial, you find that usually it has something to do with multinational drug companies where the research, and it is usually on a larger canvas. Whereas an investigator initiated study means usually you yourself are the sponsor. You have a dual role. You are the sponsor and you are the investigator. And the other facilities, the infrastructure ought to be provided by the institute where you work. And then what is ethics? It is a moral code of conduct. Now, a protocol, that is what you're going to submit, isn't it? It's a set of rules that explain the correct conduct and procedure to be followed in formal situations. And whereas procedure means, like, you break it down into smaller steps. Like, for example, if you want to teach somebody about how you're going to take a blood sample, first of all, you reassure the patient, you make the patient sit in a comfortable position, explain the procedure, all those are the smaller steps. So finally the act, it is broken down into smaller steps. So these are smaller differences between the terms which are likely to come across.
342.
1 second. Devraj,
Eh,
Devraj,
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
audible? Are the slides visible?
Yeah, ma'am. Slides are visible.
Okay. So now coming to
Is
what
there any way
ethics.
to increase the volume a bit?
Pardon?
Can you increase the volume a bit, ma'am?
Okay. Now is it okay now?
Yeah, yeah. Yes, ma'am. Okay.
Now there are various ways in which you can say what ethics is. നൈതികത മലയാളത്തിൽ പറയുന്നത് ആ നീതി അനുസരിച്ച് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. So there are various ways in which you can describe what ethics is. It's a moral philosophy, virtue, goodness, justice, all those. And what I always tell is it is that small inner voice within you which tells you what is right, what is wrong, and which is the path you should take. Now, a few examples of coming to the history of ethical guidelines. It has been there from time immemorial. Even from the time of the Vedas, you find the Dharma Shastra of Hinduism. Hinduism, you know, it is not a religion, it is a way of living. And this code was initially drafted during the Vedic period by Swayambhuva Manu. Swayambhuva Manu, a little bit of like I always cherish talking such things. Please excuse me. Swayambhuva Manu is son of Vivaswan, or the sun, and he initiated this code of conduct. It deals with the uh, rules, the duties, the responsibilities, the code, virtues, all to lead a moral good path. And this was originally described in Sanskrit, and then the British government, it is available in all Indian languages, and then the British, they English, and that is the basis for the Hindu law. Then, of course, all of you might be familiar with the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, like you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't, what to say, there are so many 10 points. And then comes the Nuremberg Code, drafted in 1947. And what led to that was the atrocities conducted during the Second World War. And it comprises of 10 points, which we'll come to later. Then, so this is constantly being refined to suit the needs of the temporal needs of the society. So, and then there came the Helsinki Declaration in 1964. That was the first code to be declared by the World Medical Association, and that was immediately followed. What led to Helsinki Declaration was the thalidomide tragedy, which of course all of you must have read about. Then came the Belmont Report that was drafted in 1979, and it was the famous, or the rather the infamous, Tuskegee syphilis study, which led to the drafting of the Belmont Report, and that clearly defines the 4 pillars on which biomedical ethics rests upon. You will come to that also later: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. Then, of course, you have the ICH GCP guidelines, International uh, Conference on Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice. And from all these points have been derived, and then the ICMR guidelines were drafted. It was drafted in 2000, and then there has been periodical revisions, the latest one being 2017. Why do you need revisions? For example, just one example I'll tell you. When all these rules were drafted, there weren't any stem cell studies. So then, to suit the need of the period, all these, they require continuous revision or the consent taking process. Initially, it was verbal, then it was documented written consent, and now we have the audio visual consent. So according to the needs of the time, all these guidelines are being revised. And I think it will be good on your part if you can go through the ICMR guidelines, and you have a small handbook also. If you are very, if there is dearth of time, there is a draft summary of that, the ICMR guidelines handbook. Then comes from all these, from the ICH GCP, the ICMR guidelines are drawn the Institutional Review Board. And the Institutional Review Board comprises of 2 arms. It has 2 arms. One is the Institutional Scientific Review Committee and the Ethics Review Committee. Both in our college, we call it the Institutional Research Committee and the Institutional Ethics Committee. Mind you, it is the Ethics Committee, not the Ethical Committee. The committee looks into the ethical aspects of whatever is to be done, but the committee is Institutional Ethics Committee. So you find that Institutional Review Board comprises of 2 arms. One is the Scientific Board Review Board, and the other one is the Ethics Review Board. Means, first of all, you should find out, you should make sure that the whatever you're planning to do is scientifically sound, and then you should take an ethics clearance. Means, here actually the ethics committee has an upper hand, because however sound your scientific study is, if it is not ethical, it's not worthwhile doing it. So it should satisfy both conditions, scientific goodness as well as ethical guidelines. Okay. And then a few more about the historical background. There was the Federal Food and Drugs Act drafted in 1906 that was aimed at preventing the manufacture, sales, distribution of adulterated and misbranded food or drug. Then came the Federal Food, Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1938. Now in our country we have the Drugs and Cosmetics Act of 1940 and Drugs and Cosmetic Rule of 1945. So this Federal Food, Drugs and Cosmetic Act was followed following sulfanilamide disaster. Here, what happened was sulfanilamide was proven in 1932 and all. It was proven to be an antimicrobial drug, but then a lot of death happened when it was prepared as an elixir. There was the vehicle was diethylene glycol, and because of this, many deaths ensued. So, whenever a new drug is released or whenever a new formulation is released, it is mandatory that you get an ethical clearance. Then I told you about the Nuremberg Code and what led to the drafting of the Nuremberg Code. And the Nuremberg Code, I told you, it has 10 points. First and foremost is voluntary consent, because when you go through the history of the World War trials, the Nazi trials, you find that all these were done on prisoners, captives, who had no voice of their own. They didn't have uh, the power to consent or not consent. So that was the first and foremost point. Then they said that it should be good for the society. You just can't cut a limb and see whether, these were some of the trials which are done. You cannot just cut off a limb and see whether it's regenerating. You cannot immerse a person into -degree centigrade to see what is happening in submarines or at high altitude. So it should be good for the society. And then it should be properly designed in the sense that there should be proper animal tests, or if you know that the natural history of a disease, and then you should follow accordingly. And you should, as far as possible, avoid mental and physical suffering to the participants. And if you find, even after starting, if you find that it is going to create more than anticipated death or disabling injury, you should stop the study then and there. And means the degree of risk shouldn't exceed the original problem. And there should be proper facilities to safeguard the participants. Me to do a study on drug-eluting stents. I am in no way qualified to do that. So you should, that again is very important. Then the next important point is, even after the subject, the participant has given consent, you say, you explain it to them, they say, okay, I'll join. But then into the trial, they find that no, it is not suiting my mentation. I wish to withdraw. Then they should have that freedom to withdraw without loss of benefits. Like you say, for example, you say that, okay, you withdraw. And then the next day you say, no, next tomorrow onwards, you can't come to this hospital. We are going to deny all facilities provided to you. That should not happen. They should be allowed the freedom to withdraw without loss of benefits due to them. And as I said earlier, whenever the moment you find a disabling trauma, and which is unacceptable, you should stop the study. Then Helsinki Declaration, it followed the thalidomide disaster, and then that was the first guideline framed by the World Medical Association. Helsinki, it is in Finland, famous for which brand of mobile phones? Okay, next is, so Helsinki Declaration, again thalidomide disaster. Thalidomide was one drug which was introduced as a wonder drug in 1957, and it was claimed to have anti-anxiety, sedative, anti-emetic properties, and it was introduced as a drug for morning sickness, and it stole the market in a large way. And what happens was most of the women, they just simply, the pregnant women, they just simply started taking the drug. And subsequently, what happened was McBride, an Australian pediatrician, he found that there was a annoyingly increased number of babies born with seal limb, flipper limbs. So, and then on meticulously questioning them, he found out that this could be linked to intake of thalidomide during the pregnancy. And then reports came in from many countries because it was widely marketed in many countries. And you'll, interestingly, if you read about that, you find that uh, there were just about 20 cases of uh, um, seal limbs phocomelia in the US. Why? Because there was a very strong person called Francis Kelsey who was in charge of the US FDA. And she was very vehement. She said, no, you cannot market this drug. You cannot introduce this drug into the American market because it has very little studies showing safety in women, especially pregnant women. So that was, but then you might wonder how come 20 children were born? Maybe because relatives took this drug to the US, and but this drug was never marketed in the US. And for this strong uh, stance taken by Frances Kelsey, she was awarded the highest honor by John F. Kennedy. So these are all very inspiring acts which we should all be aware of. And then coming to Belmont report, that follows the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study. It was started in 1935, and then here what was done was, it was the participants were all African Americans, the black, and uh, they tried to, the researchers, they wanted to know the natural course of disease syphilis in uh, the in human population. So maybe, and then they were all promised free medical aid, free meals for the marginalized society like the African American, free meals, free burial, a very great honor. All these were very attractive. So many of them, they were recruited. They voluntarily joined the study. It was okay till then. But the problem arose when in late 1930s, penicillin was discovered as a wonder drug for the treatment of syphilis. This information was withheld from the participants. So there came the unethical practice. To begin with, the study was okay. It was ethically framed over. But then the moment this the important information was withheld from them, then came the uh, unethical aspect of the study. And then there was a whistleblower, a journalist, and then he said that the study is still being continued. So then in 1979, it was Bill Clinton who, uh, in the name of all Americans, he made an apology to all these participants. And then uh, upon this, the Belmont report and the Belmont principles were drafted. The important principles are autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. Autonomy is respect to the participant, means you are, uh, what to say, accepting their decision to join or not the study. And as I said earlier, even if they deny it, you cannot deny them the benefits due to them. Justice means you are giving fair chance to everybody to be included. It cannot be like African Americans are recruited to the study, and then when you find that the drug is effective, you sell it to the white Americans. That is not fair. So there should be justice, distributive justice. There should be justice in recruiting the participants and marketing the drug. Then beneficence, of course, you look at uh, the risk benefit ratio, and if there is a clear margin of benefit over the risk, you of course you approve it. Non-maleficence means you don't do any harm to the patient. Then the CIOMS guidelines, they address, I told you. Then later came other issues in drug trials. So they have been periodically addressed. So the issue of the HIV, then post-trial access. Once you find that a drug is effective, and then what is the next procedure to make the drug available in the market? Then next is women, especially women of childbearing age. Then confidentiality in studies, compensation for serious adverse events, consent. All these are addressed in this. And this I have told you, the Benmont report and the basic principles. They are the four main pillars of biomedical research. And now coming to the Indian scenario, you find that India, our country, is a potential hub for clinical trials. Why? Because there's a large patient pool, and the relative cost of getting studies conducted is very much economical as compared to the Western world. Then you have very well trained and experienced investigators in our country. And so our country became a hub for clinical trials. Every other drug was tried, tested in our country. But then what went wrong? There was a great delay in protocol approval. You give it to the Central Licensing Authority, that is the DCGI. Then the authority, the CLA, sits on that for some time. Then you have, the red tapeism. And so it takes a very long time. You know that the drug manufacturing is a very competitive field. So everybody is in a hurry to get their drug tested and marketed. So to overcome this, there was some situations taken care of. Then poor data reporting, especially when there is a negative report or an unequivocal, ambiguous report, it doesn't get reported. So what is the problem here? Other companies might come up with similar studies. So why unnecessarily subject people to the same study, similar study? So even if you have a negative report, or even if it is an ambiguous report, you have to publish it. And then there were a lot of protocol violations. Now, GCP, good clinical practice. You should actually say GCRP, good clinical, excuse me, good clinical research practice. So, what is the need for GCP? It is actually a quality assurance. Means the Indian GCP, you say that your institute follows the GCP guidelines. Means it is a sort of quality assurance in the context of designing, conducting, recording and reporting trials. So what does that mean? First of all, it is a legal requirement. Second is, it will protect the rights, safety and confidentiality of the research participants. And the greatest one is, it has global acceptance. Like I told you, if they say that your institute, your ethics committee is registered and it follows the ICH GCP guidelines, it is globally accepted. Means why? Because it is an assurance that the data and the results are credible and accurate. So that is why we always try to follow the good clinical practice. And then what are the general principles which are looked into? There are mainly 12 general principles. Essentiality, first and foremost, the essential. Is this study essential at all? Like, do you want to, or is it a me too drug? If there is, if a new company is coming with the same chemical molecule, if it's a me too drug, why should you approve it? It is just because you know that drug trials take a long time, it's very expensive and time consuming also. So, uh, do you need it? Then next is voluntariness, non-exploitation. Then the social responsibility means here's a responsibility rests upon all stakeholders. Then the privacy, confidentiality. Then attempts for risk minimization. Then professional competence, whether your institution has the arrangements, whether you are qualified to, you're competent enough to conduct the study. Then the all throughout the designing, the conduct, the reporting, everything should be transparent and accountable. And then the everybody should be responsible, the all stakeholders. And then there should be steps for environmental protection. And see, these are the general ethical issues which are drawn from the uh, 12 general principles: benefit risk assessment, distributive justice, ancillary care. Like if in your study something goes wrong, your institute should make it a point that they will get the standard of care for that without extra payment. Then there is community engagement, then the informed consent process. We'll come to that later in depth. Then payment for participation. Payment for participation for your investigator-initiated studies, your academic trials, actually you needn't worry about that. This is mainly for sponsored trials. And this payment should be uh, uh, prorated, and then it should be uh, what to say, sufficient, or it should match the what to say, the uh, risk or the effort undertaken by the participant. For example, loss of wages, travel expenses, means it should not be an undue inducement. You say, I'll give you 10,000 for each visit. Everybody walking that way will say, okay, I'll get recruited, because everybody is in need of money. So there shouldn't be any undue inducement. Then conflict of interest. What is conflict of interest? The conflict means there will be two interests, isn't it? Please excuse me for the spelling of interest. The conflict means there will be two interests. One is your interest of professional judgment. The second is your personal interest. Like, for example, your new drug, you are a shareholder in that particular drug company, or you have to take some what to say, tests, investigations, and you own a lab where all these tests are done. Then naturally uh, the results will be skewed, isn't it? You will have a greater interest. The personal interest will be greater than the professional interest. That is what is meant by conflict of interest. So ideally, you should always declare your conflict. You'll learn about it when you start publishing your papers, because most of the journals, they ask for conflict of interest. And you also will know that provide conflict of interest, a report on conflict of interest, and privacy, confidentiality have been discussed earlier. Selection of vulnerable and social groups, later qualification, that all has been discussed. Post research access and benefit sharing. That is what I told you. The public or the participants, especially if the drug is found to be effective, there should be methods are addressed for the drug to be available, and the research results also should be provided in the public domain. And that is why we always talk about the CTRI, Clinical Trial Registry of India. Okay. Now, uh, all these have been discussed, and then now coming to the Institutional Review Board. Excuse me for a minute. Uh, Excuse me for the break. Now, the Institutional Review Board. Am I audible, Devraj?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Audible.
Okay. So, what is the response? I told you the Institutional Review Board has two arms. One is the Scientific Review Board. The other is the Ethics Review Board. And what is the what are the uh, responsibilities of the IRB? Uh, Ultimately, you sum up everything, and ultimately it is to provide safety and dignity, protect the safety and dignity and rights of the participants. That is the ultimate aim of Institutional Review Board. All these are a split up of those risk. The subject risk should be minimized. Then it should be anticipated, like there shouldn't be any unanticipated risk, all those. Then the participant should be recruited in an unbiased, that is why we talk about randomization. Then the informed consent, we'll come to that in detail later. The informed consent should be, means there is information and then there is consent. We'll come to that later. Then you should, in this era of legal battles, it is very important that you document the informed consent. Then uh, actually now they say that the ethics committee has a policing role also. They have the not just the right, it's the responsibility also to oversee the studies being conducted in the institute. And
Kala, ma'am.
yes, sorry for the interruption in between. Okay, and then I told you it should be properly documented, and then the privacy should be maintained. Confidentiality means just because a person has agreed to be part of the study, especially this comes to when you publish the report. Uh, the what to say, the result should be anonymized. There shouldn't be any point which will point to the identity of the participant. But this is a challenge because especially case reports or case series and all, where there are just one or two cases and all, everybody will know that this person is this, which has been mentioned. So as far as possible, you should try to anonymize the data. Hello, Devraj, you said something?
No, ma'am, there was some interruption from one of the participants. It's okay, ma'am.
Okay. And then, as has been said earlier, not only the scientific content, the ethical content is also very important. However scientifically valid the study is, if it is not ethically clear, if it is not ethical, if it is unethical, you have no right to continue with that study. Okay, now coming to the ethics committee of the, so IRB, Institutional Review Board, it has the scientific committee, the ethics, IEC is the institutional ethics committee. The objectives of the institutional ethics committee of TDMC is 1, 2, 3 up to 100. It is always protect dignity, rights and safety of research participants. And then comes, you ensure that the universal ethical values are maintained, but then it should be in the context of the local customs and values. For example, like if you were to do a study on maybe the pregnancy in a Western world, the number of non-married pregnant ladies may be great, but then you cannot adopt it like that. It should always match the local values and customs. And so these are the points should be to be noted. And coming to the composition of the ethics committee, it composes of the chair, and then mind you, the ethics committee should be registered. And as of now, there are 2 registrations to be done. One is with the CDSCO, that is Central Drugs Standard Control Organization, CDSCO. That is especially for sponsored trials. And the academic trials, you should you need register only with the Department of Health Research. It is not mandatory that you register it with the CDSO, but fortunately our institute has registered with both these organizations. And coming to the composition, the prime person is the chairman, and the qualities of the chairman is he should be a knowledgeable person and he should be independent to the institution, means he should not belong to the institution, he should be a person from outside the institution. Then you have the member secretary. Why outside the institution? Because it will allow fairness of the study. Like if, for example, a person within the institution affiliated to the institution is the chairman, there is very likelihood that all trials are cleared. That should not happen. The ethical value should be looked into and then only cleared. So that is the basis why the chairman should always be a person from outside the institute. Now coming to the member secretary, on the other hand, should be from within the institute. Why? Because it's the responsibility of the member secretary to convene the meetings, find the collate all protocols, find the convenience of the members, and then convene the meeting and then issue the certificates. Then there is a mix of medical, non-medical, affiliated, non-affiliated persons. You have a basic medical scientist, a clinician, you have a legal expert, that is compulsory. Then you have a social scientist or an ethicist or a theologian. That is, this person will see whether the study is appropriate to the social context, then you have a lay person. So you find that the ethics committee is multidisciplinary. You have dependent, independent, affiliated, non-affiliated people, and they should be competent. And you should get their confidentiality statement, conflict of interest statement, and they should be willing to work also. It is said that in the we have an SOP, and it is said that if a person continuously absents, at least in our SOP, continuously absents for 3 or more meetings, that person can be removed and can be substituted by somebody else. And uh, well, every 2 years, in our college, the committee, the period of the committee is for a period of 2 years, and every 2 years at least 50% of the members should be removed and renewed. The maximum number of period a person can be a member is 3. 1 second. I said 2 year. It is renewed every 3 years. Okay. So maximum they can, one person can be for a maximum period of 9 years. And then in a very large institute, say for example, the All India Institute or the maybe the Sri Chitra Institute, any very large institute where a large number of the volume of trials is very high, you can have more than one ethics committees, and the members will be different for each committee. And now coming back to the composition, can a principal, the head of institution, be a member of the ethics committee? What is your opinion? Anybody from the floor? What is your opinion? Like, can the head of the institution, the principal, can she be a member of the ethics committee? No. Why? Because she is the appellate authority. If you have some grievance, it is she to whom we have to address. So if she is already a part of the committee, then the validity of the complaint is lost, isn't it? It will be always skewed. Then there will be certain institutes which do a lot of trials, but they don't have the facility to own an ethics committee. Then what can be done is they can attach to the nearest ethics committee. But then you should always enter into a memorandum of understanding. Means you should tell them that, see, these are our this is our SOP and we have all right to inspect your trial. You should get that memorandum of understanding prior. Then there can be subcommittees. In addition, some members, because certain points, you don't need the expertise of all members. For example, when you are reviewing the serious adverse event, or when you need an expedited review. Expedited review means something which has to be reviewed very quick. You can't wait for the usual 2 weeks, 1 month and all, especially in the case of a natural disaster. In such cases, you will have to review a protocol very quickly. That is what is meant by an expedited review. So you can have subcommittees where you can handpick a few members from the original committee. So accordingly, you have a full review, you have an expedited review, you can have certain studies which are exempt from review. But mind you, all these are decided by the ethics committee and not by the researcher. You just can't say, see, my study, it involves only data collection, so it is exempt from review. That is not the case. You have to submit your protocol and maybe you can request for an exemption from review, and then the chairman, the member secretary and a few people will... Hello? Hello?
No, it's okay, ma'am. It's an interruption. You can continue. Hello, ma'am.
Huh? Is there any problem?
No, it was an interruption, ma'am. You can continue. It's okay. Hello, Kala, ma'am. Hello.
Am I audible now?
Yeah, ma'am. Audible, audible.
Okay, okay. So we were talking about the different types of review that is possible. Full review means all members have to be present, and then uh, actually that's why I said you have to periodically revise your SOPs or as well, because earlier it was said that you cannot review a protocol uh, uh, in your own place online, but now times have changed. We have gone to shifted to online reviews. So that is the paradox of it. Then expedited review, I told you, in certain cases where there is a natural disaster or in such cases, then especially when there is you're dealing with secondary data. And then you also can classify the risk into less than minimal risk. Less than minimal risk means risk foreseen in the study which are not even uh, uh, equal to what you experience in your daily activities. Exactly. Say, for example, you're collecting secondary data. There isn't a risk at all, less than minimal risk. Then minimal risk means risk which is equal to what is expected in daily routine of daily living, and more than minimal risk and high risk. High risk means you have more than minimal means maybe some blood collection or something, and high risk means you have certain interventions. So this is how you classify the risk. Okay. Now, I have been talking about serious adverse event many times. Now, what is a serious adverse event? Any adverse event which is fatal, which is life-threatening, which requires or prolongs hospitalization. When you say prolong, it means more than 24 hours. Then, which leads to permanent disability, which can lead to fetal malformations. And if this adverse event has a temporal relationship to drug intake, means there is a fairly reasonable time relation between the drug intake and the appearance of the adverse event, then you call it an adverse drug reaction. And it can be, as I said, serious, non-serious, severe, not severe. What is the difference between serious and severe? Serious means as has been shown here, it's fatal, life-threatening. Severe means you have headache. It's not serious, it's not fatal, it's not going to kill you, but then the degree is very severe. So that is the difference between serious and severe. And then you can even assess the causality, like the temporal relation. Uh, there are different scales by which you can assess the causality, whereby you can arrive at various uh, uh, conclusions like definite. It is definitely due to this, you can say, where you say that there is known similar the reports in the literature, then there is a temporal relationship, then there is de-challenge and re-challenge. De-challenge means the reaction stops when you stop the drug or the intervention. Re-challenge means it reappears when you reintroduce the intervention or the drug. Actually, re-challenges in some instances it's not ethical also. So, and then definite, probable, possible, unlikely, doubtful, or unaccessible. This is the way in which you classify the adverse events. Now coming to the informed consent document. As the name suggests, it has two parts. One is the information, second is the consent. And this informed consent, it should be given voluntarily. You explain all details to the participant in a non-technical language, and uh, you shouldn't intimidate them with what to say, very high flown tech terminologies and all, scaring terminologies. uh, or it should be in non-technical and in a language which is known to the participant. And for this, you should explain it to them in the presence of a witness, so that you are sure that the person has understood it. And after having fully understood it, and after having what to say, chance to clear doubts, they can ask you questions. Oh, okay, doctor, now what all am I supposed to do? What will happen if I stop it? Or what will happen if I decline? All those, they can ask anything, whatever, to any extent. And then after having all this comprehensive knowledge, and then they come to a volunteer. You are not coercing them, you are not forcing them into the study, you are not giving them undue inducement. After all this, the participant agrees, and then it is documented. So that is what is meant by an informed consent document. The components will come to later. So what are the essential elements in the participant in PIS, participant information sheet? I told you it has two parts, the participant information sheet and the consent form. You should explain, first of all, there should be the name of the title of the research, done by whom, because the participant should know that this is done by, it is credible, it's done by a qualified person. And what is the purpose? Is it to alleviate it? Is it to cure the disease? Is it to alleviate suffering? Or is it to just gather some medical information? All those. The purpose of the research should be specified. Then how long you should be in the study? 6 months, 1 year, or just one interaction is sufficient, cross-sectional, whatever it is. And then what are the procedures to be adopted? Like, is it just a questionnaire method, whether you're going to take an x-ray, take the blood, or whether there's any surgical procedure? And then what are the foreseeable risk? Like, especially when you say, I'm going to take 5 ml of blood, you can say that it will be slightly painful. There might be some redness in duration. Although, so you should explain everything to them, and then they will always be apprehensive about what is likely to happen if something goes wrong. So you should explain to them that you cannot give them, if at all you are not able to, especially investigator initiated studies, they are not able to give them monetary compensation. You should at least provide them standard of care, what is available in your institution. And then you should also explain to them that there are alternate procedures available. And then you, this aspect also should be explained, that whether it is confidential, and then the extent of confidentiality. Like, you say nobody will know. It's not correct. Members of the ethics committee can review the results, or if there is a sponsor, the sponsor can review the results. So who all can access that? And then you should also provide the details and contact number of the person to whom you can contact for research related queries. And then it is continuing. Then it should also contain the responsibilities of the subject. Means it is a longitudinal study. You want to meet the patient, the participant, every month. So you should explain to them. So some may say, no, 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 I can't, because I am going to Dubai to be with my children. So no, I can't. Uh, that should be explained at first, because once they start big, they get recruited, and the next review they are not coming. They say, no, 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 I can't come. So those are the subject responsibility. Or you ask them to take some medicines and maintain a diary. All those are subject responsibilities. And then if there is a payment in investigator in academic trials, there isn't scope for payment. But for sponsored trials, you can tell them that, okay, we'll give you the what to say, the travel expense if you produce the ticket for you and your accompanying person, all those. So that is especially for sponsored trials. And then they should also be assured the freedom to participate or withdraw, that is voluntariness. And as I told you, okay, you can withdraw, but tomorrow onwards don't come to this hospital for treatment or for review. We won't review you. That should not happen. You should specify that they have the liberty to withdraw from the study without loss of benefits due to them. And maybe you can also say that the number of approximate number of people who are likely to be enrolled. And then if there is a likelihood of premature termination, all these apply to sponsored trials, drug trials, like in the event of any permanent injury or unforeseeable risk, we'll be terminating it, we'll be letting it known to you, all those. Then the name I told you, whom all to contact. Then there is, so that is the participant information sheet. And then coming to the uh, consent part, you don't have to repeat all the elements of the participant information sheet. Just say the title, the researcher, and then you can just give a statement that I have understood all details regarding the study. I have had the opportunity to uh, satisfy my queries, and I voluntarily participate, agree to participate in the study. That is all what is required, and it should be affixed with the person's signature and a non-related, impartial witness. Some students, what they say is they write the relative. It's not a relative. It should never be a relative. It should be an impartial witness. So the details of the witness also should be given. And now we can think about situations where you can waive away the process of consent documentation. One is retrospective, means you are going to do a study on the available data. You are not going to have any person contact, any participant contact. So, but here what should be done is the data should be de-identified. You should get the consent from the medical superint, and then you collect the results, and you should assign a code. Saraswati, 50 years. No, it shouldn't be like that. You should assign a code to your study. And in anonymized samples, data, especially from the pathology department, the microbiology, the biochemistry department, you get samples, and you say, for example, in the pathology department, you have biopsied specimens which are already there, for which the report has been given. The uh, specimen is still there, and there, with the permission of the head of the pathology department, you can use that for your subsequent studies. But here the condition is it should be anonymized, and it should not be used for any purpose other than what is specified in your study. Then I told you, public health studies, surveillance program, program evaluation. These are situations where you do not, you are not uh, expected to take a consent. Then data available on the public domain. For example, telephone directory. Now there isn't concept of directory, isn't it? Because everybody has a mobile connection. Okay. Anyway, a telephone directory. From that, maybe you want to do some study, like you want to find out the number of doctors, or you want to find the number of people residing in a particular area, anything of that sort. So that data is already available on the public domain. In that case, you don't have to go for this consent process. Then, as I said, humanitarian emergencies, disasters, in the flood, you want to try a new drug, a new procedure. Don't say review, I should go for the ethics review. And then, so that is all time consuming. So what you can do, you are eligible for exemption from consent in such situations, but Once the crisis is over, once the emergency is over, you should get a review uh, from there, from the uh, required authorities. Is that clear? Okay. Now we talk about the vulnerable subjects. Vulnerable subjects are, subjects means participants. So vulnerable participants are people who are unable to, we were talking about the information, the consent process and all, but there are a lot of people who are not able to give a valid consent, either because they don't understand it, or because they are not of proper age, or because of their social status, they're marginalized. In such situations and all, uh, it doesn't mean that you can just go and recruit them as you wish. There are certain uh, what to say, guidelines for getting these people also recruited into the study. Now, who are the some examples of vulnerable subjects? Children. Children means minors below the age of 18. Pregnant women. Why are pregnant women vulnerable? It is not the woman who is vulnerable, it is the fetus who is vulnerable. And students, suppose I want to do a study on, say, COVID related study. I want your blood sample and all. I'm sure all PGs in my institute will agree, because they might think that, no, this lady is going to do some study. If we don't consent, she will not give approval for our study. So whether you wish or not, you might give your consent. Or for uh, our postgraduates and all, you have that fear in mind. So this lady, she's going to come as an examiner, so anyway we'll consent. That shouldn't happen. So they are all vulnerable. Then your subordinates, prisoners, service personnel, prisoner service personnel, policemen and all. Why? Because they are under the duress. They think that if they don't consent, in their reports here, something negative will be marked. So out of fear, they might consent. So such things uh, should not happen. Then demented, they don't understand. Mentally retarded people, they don't understand what is happening. Then refugees, sexual minorities. These are all some examples of vulnerable subjects. Then there is the witness consent, the verbal consent, the oral consent, electronic consent, audio visual consent. Now the CDSO states that all drug trials should be consented audio visual. But then there again, there are certain what to say, ambiguous areas, like for audio visual consenting you should have a proper room, and then at least that person who's grabbing the visuals and all will know that, isn't it? So that is not yet formalized, but then the CDSO states that all new drug trials should have audio visual consenting. uh, then consent from, for vulnerable subjects, where do you get consent from the legally authorized representative, LAR. And then there is a question of reconsent. I was talking about demented person. A person is in the ICU, comatose, and you want to do some study on that. A person is vulnerable, he cannot understand it, he cannot give a valid consent. So you approach the legally authorized representative or the caregiver, and you explain it to them, and then you get the consent. But the next day or 2 days later, the person becomes conscious, very lucid. Then what is your responsibility? You should take a reconsent from the participant. Similarly, in longitudinal studies, you have recruited them when they were 16 years of age or 12 years of age, and this study is going on. After 10 years, they attained the majority. When they were minors, the consent was taken from their parents. So now once they have attained 18 years of age, you should explain it to them and take it. So these are certain situations where you take a reconsent. Then there is the gatekeeper consent, the community consent. Gatekeeper consent means when, especially when you go to tribal areas, the community leader you should get the consent from the community leader. Or when you want to take subject participants from what to say, destitute home. They take the consent from the warden. Those are all examples of gatekeeper consent and community consent. Now, what is an assent? Assent is the uh, approval, uh, affirmation from a minor. Okay, we were talking about minors, that they are vulnerable. So here again, there are certain situations. Uh, if the minor is less than 7 years of age, you just have to take the parental consent. You explain everything in detail to the parent, you take the parental consent. But 7 to 12 years means they can understand, they have reached age of cognizable age. So what you can say is, what you can do is, you read it out to them in the presence of the parent and a witness, and then you get an affirmation. Say for example, you want to do a study where there is blood collection, 2 ml of blood, you collecting 2 ml. The parent says okay, but then the child says, a cognizable age, isn't it? The child says, no, 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 you can't prick me. I won't allow that. You should honor the child's uh, agreement, and then you should not recruit that child. So 7 to 12 years means you explain, read out the information, explain it to the child in the, and that too in a very simple language, not avoiding all technical words, jargon. And then you in the presence of the parent and the witness, you the head nodding is enough. But then 13 to 18 years means you give it to them, they'll read it, they comprehend it, and they sign it in addition to the parental. So now you find that less than 7 years, only parent. 7 to 12 years, the child's nodding plus the parent signature. 13 to 18, parent signature plus child signature. Is that clear? Okay. Then parental permission. Ideally, both parents. You should get permission from both parents. Uh, but then there are certain situations where you can waive that. Where you must have seen that movie Ayalam Nyanam Tamil, the complications of one parent consenting, the other not. Okay, so you are uh, exempted to take consent from one parent if one is deceased or unknown, incompetent, or not reasonable, physically available. The parent is in Dubai or in the US. You can't ask them to come and take. Maybe you can talk to them over the phone. That is all what is possible. Then again, waiver of parental consent also is possible. When you are dealing with neglected or abused children, there the parental consent is going to be detrimental to the child, isn't it? It's never going to be in the interest of the child. So that those are situations where you can, in the interest of the medical community, you can explain that in the presence of a witness. You can do away with parental consent as well. So now, see, I have put certain situations here, and then what is the, see, these are the options that are available to you. The sixth one, study in an institution, I meant home for destitute, prison, or home for mentally challenged people, like that. That is what is meant by an institution. Okay. Now, this I explained earlier, obtaining a valid consent in case of emergencies, natural disasters, it's a challenge. So what is what is expected of you? You should come to a rational conclusion after weighing the various risks and benefits, and then you come to a conclusion, and then if you have to, and most important here is it should be documented, and after the study it should be reviewed by the full committee. Now this is, I'll send you the slides so that I don't have to read all this. It just shows that the information sheet, it should contain all information. Okay, here you're trying to put something in yellow because that is not applicable to you because you can't naturally. So what you can do is you can decide to recruit people coming to the OP or who are in the ward. So there's no question of travel, such things. Okay. And the consent form, you don't have to repeat all information which is included in the participant information sheet. You just say that you have understood all these and then you take the signature. And normally what is done is you sign the participant information sheet is signed by the investigator. A copy is given to the participant. The consent form is signed by the participant and the witness, and the copy is retained by the investigator. Is that clear? Okay. So now coming to the last phase, after having known all this, so you know what all should be done, and then the protocol submission. First page, it should be just the title page, the study title, name, and details of the PI, whether you're a JR, you are an SR, you're an assistant professor, whatever, and your contact number. Why? Because it's easy for me to track you all. I don't have to search all pages. So the title page should contain just all these. Then there should be a request to the chairman of the ethics committee because I told you there are two committees here. You all will give the protocol to the review committee first, scientific review committee. So there you address it to the chairman of the review committee, and then normally what is seen is everything you attach to the ethics committee also. You don't have to. You give a copy to the review committee, you get it reviewed there, you get the certificate, you attach a copy, and then bus everything, all that is over. Now you have to give a request to the chairman of the ethics committee alone, and that should be forwarded by the head of the department because nothing should come to the committee without knowledge of your head. And here, as what to say, economical and to save trees, what can be done is you don't have to, you give a request to the HOD signs it, the HOD gives a request to the chairman, then you give another request. And all this is nonsense. You don't have to. You just write to the chairman, and the chairman is a sir here. Our chairman is Dr. T.P. Tangappan. Sir is retired professor of dermatology from this institution. Presently, he is the principal of Pushpagiri Institute of Medical Sciences. So it is a sir. So what you can do is you just write to the chairman seeking approval. Kindly review this and give me an approval. And in the same sheet, you can ask your HOD to forward it. Is that clear? Then if there are, okay, then the next page should contain details of the PI, your name, designation, contact number, all those. Then the guide, co-guide, if there is a co-guide, and with their signatures, all signatures. If there are co-guides from other departments as well, you should get their details and signature as well. Then you should attach a copy of certificate of approval from the review committees, SRC, scientific IRC, approval. Then if it involves other departments as well, say I told you the X-ray department, radiology department, or the microbiology department, the biochemistry department, like you are going to collect details, pathological reports, and if there are such issues, get consent from. Thus, this can be again taken from, you can give a request and then you can get their initial in the same sheet. You don't have to put other papers as well, and you can also use both sides. Okay, then next is you should give the introduction, background, and rationale, and uh, like why you're going to do this study. It should be very brief. Then review of literature. It should be brief and relevant to the study. You don't say something about what happened elsewhere or something like that, which are unrelated to the study. And uh, it should be maybe 5 to 10 reviews, and uh, preferably previous 5 years, because very old ones, the newer information has been gathered. So maybe you can restrict yours to the previous 5 years. Next is you have to give a research question and a hypothesis. All these can be drawn from your title, your research question. First of all, you frame your title, and then you can, from that itself, you can draw the research question and your hypothesis. Then your aims and objectives. It should be SMART, means it should be specific. It should be, what to say, um, uh, uh, achievable, it should be relevant, it should be time bound. And so you give the aims and objectives. Sometimes there may be just a single objective, or if there are secondary objectives, you put them down. Then materials and methods. Under this, you can give all details regarding your data collection, how you're going to, from where you're going to gather that data, how you're going to choose your participants, all those things you can. And your plan for data analysis. Don't just say it will be entered into SPSS version 21. Now you should specify what method you're going to do for analysis. Then the ethical considerations. Let me like you will be getting the approval of the review IRC and the ethics committee. Then you will ensure privacy, confidential, all those come under the ethical considerations. Then your expected outcome of the study, how your study is going to benefit the scientific community. Then your plan of action, that is a Gantt chart. Like the first month you're going to do this, collecting the review. Then your second month you're going to write the protocol. Third month you're going to give for the ethics review, whatever. You plan it accordingly. And then next is you give the references that should be made in the Vancouver style. Then whatever annexure you have, that should be attached. For example, your pro forma case record form. Then, and pro forma, mind you, retrospective studies and all, it's always anonymous, dealing with the personal data. You anonymize the data. Then if you're using tools or scales, for example, you have your visual analog scale, or you are going to use a what to say, that grip, hand grip dynamometer or something. Anyway, whatever you're going to use, you should include that. Then comes your participant information sheet and consent form in English and in Malayalam. Malayalam means it's vernacular. Suppose you were doing your post graduation in Trivandrum Medical College, or maybe Kannur Medical College, you should also include it in Tamil as well as Kannada, because you get a lot of people who are Tamil speaking, or so that is all common sense. Then dummy tables, how we are going to gather the information, and then how we are going to collect the inference. So that, and fee receipt. Normally, Gemma in the section will collect 10 copies of your this thing protocol only on payment of receipt. So that's why I put it as optional. So that is not very, and just check it. What I remember is PGs have to pay 750 rupees, and staff faculty 1000 rupees. Just check it. And so that is optional. And then next is you should tag the papers. That is very important, because many feel that why is this lady being very what to say, choosy about all this. It is because these should be archived, and just try it at home. You staple a few papers, you take it out, put it inside the packet once more. You do this 2 or 3 times, the papers, they start coming out, each leaf. So that shouldn't happen, because all these should be archived for 3 years. So to help me out, that I can say, to help me out, tag the papers. Then you should number the pages. Why numbering the pages? That is again for convenience, because when we all, there are 10 of us here in the review committee, when we review it, if there is a mistake, or if there is a, what to say, scope for explanation, if there is a scope for correction and all, if we tell you the page number, it is easy for you to pick up also. Not just 10 of us, it's easy for you to. So always number the pages and submit 10 copies. Is that clear? So this is in a nutshell of what is expected of you. Now the remaining what is there is when you finish the study, you give a small summary of your study. That can be done along with submission of your thesis. Then next is always be very careful when you publish your thesis, because there shouldn't be falsification, fabrication. Then you shouldn't leave out the guide, the co-guide, get their consent, all those are all other matters dealing to publication. So I hope you have understood so far. Yes or no? Have you a comment? Have you a what to say, query?
Actually, you can ask any doubts to madam, or at least say in one line, like a remark as to madam's class. She'll be feeling happy about it. Alle madam. എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു
പിന്നെ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും. So when you don't have questions, it is said that either you have understood everything or you have not understood anything. I go for the first option. Okay, is that clear? Seiru, shall I leave?
They're actually typing their responses, madam. There's
okay, chat box. Okay.
Very informative class, ma'am. From Sushma Devi.
Okay, that is fine.
Seems
shall
that the
previous sharing? Shall I
yeah, you can stop sharing.
Yeah. Madam, thank you very much for this informative session. Now, PGs എന്തെങ്കിലും പറയാനുണ്ടോ? Like any community medicine PGs or any PG for that matter. We'll give a one minute.
Okay. Seiru, frankly speaking, I'm benefiting. I stand to benefit because I always enjoy interaction with the younger minds. So, and each time you present.
Okay, madam.
Shall I leave, Seiru?
Madam, chat le varunundu. Thank you, ma'am, for the detailed and informative class. Thank you so much, madam. So, thank you for taking part in this. In spite, I know you're busy, but finding time for us, for all of us, our PGs.
It's a pleasure, and especially when it comes to ethics, I love it. Okay.
I know.
It's really a good session, ma'am. Very detail was fully covered.
Seiru and Devraj, do me a favor. If you come across any comments, like if any point is not clear or something of that, so do let me know so that I can share it with you at least.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Definitely, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Everybody. Okay.
Okay. Dr. Devraj, shall we also wind up today? Like, unless, like if anybody has to say anything, we'll just give 1 minute. Okay, very informative. Okay, then we'll just wait for 1 more minute. After that, we'll wind up. And hope you are all proceeding. If you have got any difficulties with your videos, with the assignments given, amidst this busy schedule, please feel free to share it.
Yes, I think.
Okay, we can.
Call it a day, ma'am.
Okay, call it a day. Thank you, all of you.